With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, even if the whole world is telling you to move, it is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say, no, you move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for being with us here on Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. Thank you so much for being with us here on the program this afternoon on this Monday. We have a lot to go over, and one of the things that we always start with and have really since this epidemic started is our daily Alabama coronavirus update, how we're handling it, what our numbers look like, that sort of thing. And so we'll go ahead and start with that right now. Now we'll go ahead and go to the data, directly to the data from the Alabama Department of Public Health. Now you can see on this that to date, the Yellowhammer State has 3,762 confirmed cases, just under 30,000 total tested. We have 62 that we know have died from the illness, and also 457 total hospitalizations related to the COVID-19 virus statewide. So there's a lot there to digest, but I think probably the thing that's most important to bring up, because of course you are seeing that there has been almost 1,000 new cases since the last time we had a show. Of course, we run the regular show from Monday through Thursday and then sort of have an entertainment show on Friday. But the first 4 days of the week we do the coronavirus update, and right now you can see that there's been an almost 1,000 increase since the last time we met. That's 952 since Thursday. The fact that we've had so many in such a short amount of time is something that is startling and is something that should worry people. I think that even though you don't need to panic, and I've been saying that since the very beginning, this is something that is a cause for concern and something to look into how all this is happening. So the deaths, on the other hand, have started to flatline. Now, I got very worried and started to sort of get that empty feeling in the pit of your stomach when I started to see that the deaths had climbed to double digits in a single day. That, of course, was on Friday. We had a big spike in deaths then, the biggest one that we've had so far. We didn't meet on this show, but we did see that there was that big spike for 10, and then it went down to 3 and then 1. So the deaths have actually started to decrease to the point to where it looks like that they're at where they were a few weeks ago on how many we're getting per day. So that's something that is really important to understand right now, comparing the deaths that have started to flatline since Friday. Our death rate was about 2-ish%, which is a little high compared to other nations, compared to even some other states, and we were concerned about that. I think that that's probably due to a fact that we weren't testing quite as aggressively as some of our neighbors. But anyway, that death rate has started to dip a little bit. We're under the 2% mark, and Dr. Anthony Fauci has been talking quite a bit about some of these antibody tests that would actually test whether or not a person used to have coronavirus but doesn't now. That's really important for a number of reasons, because that would give us a pretty decent indication as to how many people were actually exposed to this thing versus the people that felt bad enough that they felt they needed to go in and get a test, because that not only hides the completely asymptomatic people, which some studies now are showing could be as high as 50%, but it also hides the people that did show symptoms, but they were not nearly severe enough to justify them getting the test because they didn't feel as though this was coronavirus. So they had very mild symptoms that wouldn't make them think that they needed to go get this thing. And so if that takes place, and we do have pretty robust testing for the antibodies that are created when a person has coronavirus, that could make a significant difference, because if we've got, 50% more people with the Wuhan flu that were completely asymptomatic, and this is just a shot in the dark, I don't have any data to back this up, but let's say we get maybe 5 to 10% of people that did have symptoms, but they were very mild and they weren't sure whether they had the Wuhan flu or not. If that is the case, well, then that death rate is going to go significantly below 1%. And so that makes a pretty substantial difference in the way that we're looking at our current rates, our confirmed cases, and it gives us a better idea of how lethal this thing actually is. We won't know that until the tests commence, obviously. But if that takes place, that is a really useful tool in the arsenal to help us understand the data that we already have. That's not necessarily even giving us so much new data as it is giving us some perspective to understand and interpret and act upon the data we already possess. I mean, yes, it is a new form of data, but it's one that doesn't change the death rate, doesn't change the confirmed cases. It just gives us insight into exactly what those mean. So let's go ahead and look at the new cases in Alabama in graph form, because I think this will help us as well. So one of the things that you're seeing there is that we are having a steady incline in the new cases. But one thing that I find really interesting about this is incline, yes. Numeric increase, yes. Spike, actually, no. We are still not seeing those big exponential numbers that everybody, including myself, was predicting for the longest time. And that's really important for a number of reasons. So the fact that we actually had less new cases yesterday than we've had in the past shows a couple things, and we're going to get to that in a second. But just look at that line there. There is an increase, but that is nowhere near the steep increase that we were seeing after most nations and most states, most nations. I don't know about the individual states. The only state I've been keeping up with is Alabama, and then I'm looking at that compared to some of the state data and some of the national numbers. But as far as looking at other states, I've not looked at their individual cases and where they've spiked, except for I think New York and California. But my point in all of that is, we're not coming to that steep spike where there's just a massive incline in this chart so far. We've not seen it thus far. Maybe this is an indication that we won't see it. It's really hard to make that call right now. I'm really just not sure. But that's where we stand as of now. And you'll notice that if you were looking at yesterday's numbers compared to a couple days before, the incline actually started to not look as big as it did from the days previous. And one of the ways that you can kind of see and understand that, these are the new cases in the state of Alabama. So this is just a day-to-day look at the new cases in that particular day. And you'll notice this one is much more sporadic. But you may recall that last week, because if you'll look at the 7th, 8th, 9th, if you look at those numbers, there was a steady increase, and it looked as though Alabama was gearing up for that big spike that we were all expecting. So far, that has not happened. You'll notice that on the 11th, on the 10th, we dipped back down. On the 11th, there was a spike again, and then it dips down again. So there was a pretty big spike on Saturday, on Friday. But if you're looking at the numbers now, they've started to go into a decline. Now, I don't want to jump the gun here, and I don't want to definitively say that this is the case, because if you've been following this program at all, you understand that this whole thing has been a roller coaster, that it's been very unpredictable, and that's, weirdly enough, that's the only prediction that I've gotten right, is that things would be unpredictable. But that's a real feather in my cap. But nonetheless, here we are looking at the data, and you're looking at a pretty big incline in new cases and then a definitive decline, at least over the past 3 days. That doesn't mean that we have peaked. That doesn't mean that we have plateaued. But if you're looking at the data comparatively to the way that it's played out with others, and you're also looking at our timeline relative to places like Spain, like Italy, like China, if you're looking at those things, we're on a trajectory to where we're about 50 days behind China. And that means that we are nearing the part where they started to plateau at least a little bit. We're a little early, a little ahead of schedule by that rubric, being 50 days ahead of China. But if that is the case, it is possible that what we are seeing now, and this may be completely different tomorrow. We could have, 500 new cases, and that would change everything that I'm saying. So understand that this thing is in a state of flux right now. But right now, looking at the available data, there's actually some decent reason to believe that we're starting to hit that peak, that our graph is starting to plateau, and before long we'll hit our peak and then we'll start going on the decline. Again, could be wrong, but that's what they're saying right now. There is a independent firm that is looking at the different states and where each of them they predict to peak. They're saying that ours is about a week out, and that may prove to be the case. That could very well happen. We don't know that for sure. They're saying about a week to 2 weeks out is where Alabama's peak is, and they have sort of odds on how likely that is or how unlikely that is. And it's very possible that their recommendation is true. And by the way, I'm not saying that I believe that we have peaked. I'm saying there is some data to suggest that. That's two very different things. So if I happen to be wrong on this one, you'll know that I was saying it's a possibility, not necessarily that I think that that's where we are, but there is some reason to definitely believe that. Now, based on all this, because this is all important, that we understand in the context of, are we testing enough? Because if we're not testing enough, then the data is no good, and it's not something that could use to either be predicted or really useful to us in deciding what exactly we're supposed to do. So let's go ahead and look at this last graphic here that shows the amount of testing that we are doing. Now I want you to notice, and this one is really strange because this is new testing. This isn't total testing. So this is just new tests that are being done on a daily basis. One thing that you'll notice that is really strange is we occasionally have lulls. Now, those lulls where there's no testing being done at the beginning, that was when we were testing, but the Alabama Department of Public Health hadn't been reporting on the numbers. And so you'll notice that there's a lull there. And then we slowly start ratcheting up. And then all of a sudden, we have a day where we got no new test on the 7th and then doubled on the 8th. And then you'll get another one that is really strange that happened over the weekend where we got no new test at all on the 10th, the 11th, or the 12th. But today, we're getting a boost in new testing that more than doubles the previous record. So what the heck's going on there? There's a couple of different possibilities. Having these multi-day hangups followed by a surge suggests that what has actually happened here is that there has been some kind of reporting error, or there has been some kind of reporting qualification that just has not yet been met, and because of that, they do not put out the numbers until that qualification is met. I'm not exactly sure what that looks like. Probably some kind of regulation where they have to clear it and double check the numbers or something like that before they actually put it out. That's what I'm guessing is going on here. I could be wrong. It also could be a shortage. And we know that multiple testing facilities within the state of Alabama have had to close shop because they ran out of tests. And with the way that the climate is going right now, with everybody on the national level trying to get those, I understand that is a very difficult thing to do. So I'm not trying to say that the Alabama Department of Public Health screwed up here, or it's the fault of the doctors or nurses working the facility, anything like that. But I'm saying it is a reality that we have to acknowledge that some of these places are running out of testing supplies. Now, is it possible that every single testing facility within the state of Alabama on the same day ran out of tests and were not able to report new numbers? Kinda, but it's super unlikely, especially considering we've got a few dozen of them now. Which would mean, based on my understanding of what all is going on here, it probably is something like a recording issue that they're having problems getting all the numbers recorded at the same time, and because of that, they're holding off on releasing those new numbers until they have them. That would also explain why we'll have a couple days with nothing, and then another day where we have tons of new tests that more than double the previous record. That seems to be what is actually going on here. It's not that they're running out of supplies and then they're getting some supplies in and they do a whole bunch of tests and then hold off for a little while. That doesn't seem to be the case. It seems more likely that what is happening is they're having recording issues in the way that they're keeping track of this, which, especially as a data person, upsets me. And I really wish that they were a little bit more on the ball with recording this stuff and making sure the new test numbers get out every day. But frankly, I'm far more concerned about the confirmed cases numbers being updated every day, which to our knowledge, and the best as all of us can tell, is happening. Because the numbers are increasing every day. I mean, I'd rather them not increase, but at the same time, at least the increase lets me know that, yes, they are doing some testing, because it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense that we had new tests every single day in the state of Alabama, but didn't have a single new test reported. Well, that's not possible. To have new people confirmed with the virus, you kind of have to be able to test them to ensure that that is happening. So it seems to be some kind of recording issue. I hope that they rectify it and rectify it soon. But ultimately, the fact that they're keeping up with the new cases is the far more important thing to look at. Now, there is an article out for the state of Alabama that I really did want to address quickly from Yellowhammer News. Headline, UAB down to 38 coronavirus cases, cautions, quote, "We are not in the clear yet." And it reads, the inpatient hospital at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, UAB, is down to 38 coronavirus patients from a peak of 62, according to a release from the facility on Monday. Now, that is important because you may remember we were actually covering when they had roughly that peak. They actually tweeted out about it and explained how many of their patients were on ventilators, how many of their patients needed intensive care. And so that's really important to understand. At the very start of this, they had roughly 60. And then apparently they peaked at 62, according to this article. Now they're down to 38. That suggests, and this is sort of an early warning thing, that suggests that these people are getting better. Because, of course, there have been deaths, tragically, and of course we are concerned about their families and want to make sure that they're comforted and don't want to make light of this. But the fact that the hospitals, including UAB, which is, of course, in Birmingham, which has been the hotbed for the state, is now going down in number of people they are having, means that they're not having new coronavirus patients to replace the ones that have already recovered or, unfortunately, have passed. And that's really good because that speaks to the R naught principle, because we're looking at these numbers as static. And I understand why you have to do that. We probably just don't have the recording facilities, nor do we have people that are just calling in to the Alabama Department of Public Health that are coronavirus patients that are reporting that they feel much better. That's just not a thing that is happening. And so I get that it's very hard to gather data on this. But ultimately, since we're looking at this as static, a better way to understand and look at this crisis and what the numbers actually mean in practical terms is to look at how many people are being discharged, how many people are starting to feel better, because it was never about, when we talked about either flattening the curve or making sure that our hospitals were not overwhelmed, it was never about staying under a certain number. It was always about staying under a certain number at the same time. And so the fact that our hospitals like UAB are actually reporting a decrease in cases, that's a really good sign, because that means that people are recovering faster than they're needing hospitalization. And that means that even if a whole bunch of us get sick with this thing, and even if it's really rough for a whole bunch of us, that we're not going to see the conditions that were happening, for example, in Italy and in Spain and in China, where the hospitals were just so incredibly overwhelmed that there was nothing they could do for people. They were turning people away. There were probably even people that will understand once the smoke is all cleared in Italy, never even had the coronavirus, but died because of how overwhelmed the hospitals were. I mean, if you're having a heart attack right now, God forbid that would happen and you're near one of these hospitals that is just completely full and can't take any more patients. Because then what do you do? At the very least, you'll have to wait longer to get medical attention, which could be fatal for you. And so that's something that's really important to understand as well. That when we're observing this data, that it's not a static number and that some of these people are recovering, going home, etc., etc., and the fact that the hospitals are actually seeing a decrease in their number of patients is something that is very, very promising. Now, this article continues on. While the number demonstrates progress in the state's fight against COVID-19, officials at the facility are warning that Alabama, quote, cannot afford to slip up now. The doctors and health experts believe that Alabama has not yet fully flattened the curve. They believe that people must continue to follow stay-at-home orders if Alabama wants to eliminate the threat of COVID-19. Quote, we have more than 3,000 cases in the state and will only see a decrease in numbers statewide if people continue to follow their stay-at-home orders, reads the statement from UAB. The guidance issued by the university states we are not in the clear yet. So this is good advice, and it says what we're doing right now, at least from a medical perspective, is the right thing to do, and it is working because we're not seeing that massive swell of patients and overloading our hospitals that we were expecting, which is really, really good news from UAB. Another article I wanted to go over, which is, again, another hopeful one. By the way, I didn't plan this. I didn't cherry pick through the news and say, okay, let's only look at the good stories because, first of all, that's just not my style. Second of all, it's just not something that you would be able to do even if you were trying to skew it that way, really. But today has just been a pretty good news day for the state of Alabama because we've talked about the medical side of it. Now I want to quickly address the economic side of it. Alabama actually might be one of the states that is the least affected economically by the Wuhan flu. And so to back this up, this is a graphic from Moody's Analytical being reported through Yahoo News, and you can see that on this chart, the states that are in the bright blue as opposed to the kind of faded blue, those are the ones that are going to be least affected. The more red a state is, the more affected it is, which is kind of hilarious when you look at it because I know that they didn't pick red and blue to mean party affiliation, but it's really strange to see a map of the United States where New York and California and Texas are basically the same shade of color. But anyway, that's really neither here nor there. Anyway, looking at this, you can see there that Alabama is in one of the states that is the brightest blue on this for the least exposure to the economies. Now, it's important to understand exactly how they came to this conclusion, how Alabama wound up being one of the states that is least economically affected by this virus. So they had 6 rubrics to measure this. Exposure to COVID-19, that one's obvious because the more of people with the virus that you have, the more likely it is to economically impact your state. That's part of the reason that you're seeing some of the far western states like Washington, Oregon, California, and some of the East Coast states where people come in on that side from that part of the country, places like New York and Florida, that they're going to be more economically impacted by it because they have larger exposure. 2, demographics. That's one that actually kind of works against us. We have more smokers in Alabama than the average state. We have older people in the state of Alabama than the average state. Not way older, but older than the average. Another one, the third rubric that they used here is trade and travel disruptions. Yes, that is going to be an issue for the state of Alabama, but the important thing to understand is while that's going to be worse for some states than others, Alabama's in a better position than most, but it kind of affects the entire country almost universally when it comes to trade. Now, again, this is just me spitballing here, but The reason that that is the case is that there are some states where the travel industry is not as prevalent, but overall, it's still one that is going to affect all of us at roughly the same rate. So it's not a big distinguishing factor, but you can imagine if, for example, you're New York and one of your big businesses is import export, then you're no more affected by the prices of imports and exports than people in the state of Alabama. But where you are more affected is you've got an awful lot of dock workers. You've got an awful lot of people that make their living transporting those things once they are brought into the country or once something is being prepared to leave the country. See, that's where your economic impact is from that standpoint. So the overall trade and what it does to world markets and the prices, that more or less, to some degree, affects pretty much all of the states on roughly the same way, about to the same amount. The big difference is places that have large ports that do a lot of importing and exporting, and they make some of their money doing that. They have industries based on that. Alabama really doesn't, except for some in Mobile, and I would argue not even a whole lot there. But overall, that's just something that is going to affect other states more than us. Number 4 is tourism. Now, this is one that affects Alabama more than you would think, because typically we do not think of Alabama as a tourism state, because when you think of like going to the beach or something like that, you think about Florida. When you think about going to the mountains, you think about Tennessee, and that's understandable. But it's also important to note that we actually do have quite a bit of tourism dollars, and I know this from a couple of different sources. One, my dad being a hunter ed instructor for much of his career, and my mother actually being in the hotel business. So Alabama does a decent amount of tourism. In fact, about 7-ish% of our economy is based on the tourism industry, which is not massive, but it's also not something to sneeze at. And a lot of that comes in from fish and wildlife. A lot of people come into the state of Alabama to fish and hunt. That doesn't affect us as much right now, because the only thing that's really going to affect us this time of year, since most of our hunting seasons have more or less ended, the only thing that's really going to affect us here are people that come in, and this is another one that you wouldn't think of, but people do come from far and wide to Alabama, bird watchers. That's actually something that's pretty prevalent. We have vast natural resources. We have a lot of people that tour for that, oddly enough, bird watching and other wildlife observation. And then, of course, beach season is going to hurt us, especially around Baldwin and Mobile County. But other than that, we'll probably be more or less okay. And so it's going to have us take a hit, but we're in a better position than some of the states that rely very heavily on tourism. States like Jersey for the casinos, for Nevada for their casinos, for Florida for its beaches and spring break, that kind of thing. So we're actually going to do okay when it comes to that. Not great, because like I said, Alabama depends a little bit more on tourism than people would think, but it is something that is going to help us out. Number 5 is finance. I'm really not sure how we did on that one. I'm not sure how we would do compared to the others. I know that we do have a pretty healthy manufacturing industry, especially when it comes to automobiles. So I'm not sure about that one. We don't have a lot of state debt, which is probably something that helps us in that area. And then number 6, commodities. Now, this is one area where Alabama probably shines, because God forbid this would happen, but let's say the entire country was just unable to produce things. Alabama could survive on its own. It would be difficult, and we wouldn't have near the variety of goods and services that we enjoy right now. But if push came to shove, let's just say the entire world except for the state of Alabama just got wiped off the map overnight. Well, that would be, as you can imagine, something that would be economically devastating, and we'd have to make several important lifestyle changes. But the point is, we could survive. We've got enough natural water resources. We've got enough natural farming. We have enough in resources, even in oil, off the Gulf Coast to be able to survive and be okay with just using resources that come from the state of Alabama or Alabama's waters. That makes a significant difference, and that's probably one of the reasons that we're going to be impacted less by this particular disease. Some other good news is that University of Alabama, yes, despite being an Auburn man, I am going to speak well of the University of Alabama, two of their economists, Dean Sam Addy of the College of Business and the Center for Business and Economic Research executive director, Ahmad Ijaz, I believe is the correct way to say that. They both predict that Alabama is going to be on the road to recovery by the end of the year, which is really good news. If that is the case and their prediction turns out to be correct, and by the way, the normal recovery that they're talking about, sort of the measuring stick that they're using here, it's important to understand what that means is 2 healthy quarters of consistent growth. So roughly 6 to 8-ish months is what you're looking at there. And so if Alabama can do that and be on the road to that by the end of 2020, and we have 2 quarters of consecutive normal recovery growth, then we're back to maybe not exactly where we were, but getting pretty close to being back to normal by the summer of 2021, despite all of this. That's pretty dang good considering that there are also people predicting a Great Depression. Now, who knows if their models will actually play out? Just like a weather person, these are educated guesses and predictions, not guarantees. And so it's important to understand that just because economists predict it, that is not necessarily something to celebrate in and of itself, because we have to actually do it as opposed to it just being possible in theory. But at least the economists are looking at this and not saying, man, this is going to be something that's going to take us 10 years to be able to recover from. That's not what they're saying at all. They're saying that it actually could be done relatively quickly. That's something to celebrate. That's something to applaud. Hopefully their model turns out to be correct. Hopefully we can be in a normal recovery season by the end of the year, possibly even sooner. Now, the one thing that is important to understand in all of that is if we have a really good fourth quarter and we do really well for things like Christmas, we could be on that just a little bit faster. But the fact that there are models that have us bouncing back from this thing in about 6 months, that's actually really, really good compared to what the alternative suggestions have been. Hopefully they turn out to be correct. And I swear I didn't plan this because it was a reaction to Alabama's. In fact, I originally planned to do this story on Thursday. I just didn't have time. I started to run out. It's not just Alabama. The University of Auburn is definitely, or University of Auburn. Bo Jackson said that one time in an interview. Auburn University, my own alma mater, they are actually working on the reinvent machine. You may remember that we were talking about the reinvent machine just recently. I want to say it was either early last week or maybe even a couple weeks ago, but a couple of Auburn professors got this idea that they could take CPAP machines and basically make a kit that restructures it into a workable ventilator, and it got a lot of press and some recognition. And this video has been circulated. It's gone viral. It's achieved a little bit of national attention. So Auburn put this thing together. It's about a minute long, if I'm remembering correctly. So I wanted us to go ahead and look at this. And instead of trying to explain how all of this works, which granted I'm pretty good at, I would rather let the scientists and the people that designed it themselves do it in their own words. I think that they'll do a little bit better job. So I want you to see this clip that Auburn put together.
Hi, I'm Michael Zabala, and this is Tom Birch, and we are faculty members in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at Auburn University. And we are here to introduce the reinvent device that is intended to allow a conversion of a CPAP machine into a ventilator. And this effort was done in response to the global pandemic, COVID-19. This device utilizes mainly 2 valves. One is open while the other is closed, and they alternate to allow inspiration and expiration. The device also utilizes a common CPAP machine, therefore it's able to produce warm, moisturized air to deliver to the patient. The setup assumes medical equipment, including the tracheal tube, down the inspiration and expiration tubes, and including the viral filters that are attached directly to the device. The device is unable to detect a voluntary breath from the patient, and the breathing rate and other parameters are set here on the display box on top.
All right, so this device can be built for approximately $700 per copy. And it's made from commonly available parts that you can get from McMaster Carr or Granger. Automation Direct, typically available in 2 to 5 days. It takes around 4 hours right now. We may get faster, but right now it takes about 4 hours to build one of these. So we turn the CPAP machine on, and the CPAP machine is set at 20 centimeters of water to try to give good pressure. We turn this machine on, and it begins to cycle, and you can see the bags inflate, deflate on our dummy patient. Currently, we're set at 15 breaths per minute and a 2-to-1 inspiration to expiration ratio.
Behind the machine is a PEEP valve that is currently set to, I believe, is it 5 centimeters of water?
5 centimeters of water. And there's also a port to allow you to bleed in oxygen into the incoming air for the patient.
Right, so it's really cool to see a university right here in the state of Alabama coming up with a device that could potentially save thousands, if not millions, if this thing were to hit the fan and we really did need ventilators. Now, today President Trump talked about in one of his briefings, and we'll get a little bit more into detail on that briefing here in a little bit, but one of the things that President Trump specifically addressed in his briefings is that people are starting to look at these predictions and where they thought they would be and saying that they don't think that they're going to need the level of resources that they originally did, that they're not going to need as many ventilators as they did at one time. So maybe what happens with this is we wind up not needing it. Okay, I'd 1,000 times rather have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. And by the way, this actually got a little bit more attention the other day because just last week, late last week, I want to say it was Thursday around noon is when the test was actually conducted. They did conduct their first successful test on an animal. So they had the device, they took a goat and they knocked it out, gave it some anesthesia, and then they hooked up this device with a CPAP machine and repurposed to be a ventilator and tested it on him, and everything went successful. In fact, one of the professors said that it went better than they were expecting. This comes via Auburn University's College of Engineering news page. Quote, "It went better than I expected in being able to ventilate the animal," said anesthesiologist Glenn Woods, who is affiliated with multiple Alabama hospitals. "This test confirms Reinvent's potential to meet the demand for desperately needed ventilators." And I've got to say, I just am so incredibly proud of my university for coming up with this. And you have to remember, too, there may be some profit incentive here, but this is just really the spirit of America on bright and bold display. That when you have neighbors, when you have people in your country that you know are vulnerable, that there is this problem that is coming forward, the first thing Americans do is, all right, how do we come up with a device to fix it? How can we use our own ingenuity to work around this thing and try to invent it and get better? And they're able to do so with amazing efficiency. We're going to have a ventilator shortage? All right, let's come up with a way to use a device that is common throughout the various states that we can just repurpose it and for a few $100s and about 4 hours of labor, put it together and have it running and it works just like a regular ventilator. I mean, that is just astounding because I would have never thought of that. I would have never thought of something like this. And yet, because of this, they were able to put it all together and make it work. And they've done this thing together in a matter of a couple weeks and they're already animal testing on it. I mean, that's just amazing. And it does speak to the ingenuity both of people at Auburn University and within the state of Alabama as a whole. I mean, there's no better example of American ingenuity than that right there. So what we'll do is we'll take a quick break and then we're going to come back in just a minute right here on Tactics.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. And now it's time for a reading from the SJW Bible, the only Bible printed on 100% organic biodegradable paper. Today's reading comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19, verses 3 through 10. And it says, Some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And he answered and said, Have you not read on your Bible apps that he who created him from the beginning made them male and female, and trans, and pansexual, and non-binary, and Jupiter gender, or one of the 150 other options? And said, For this reason, a man/woman/other shall leave his father and mother, or father and father, or mother and mother, or two mothers, father, and their special friend Sequoia, and be joined to his wife, or wives, or husband, or life partners, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer 2 or 3 or 14, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. I mean, unless of course it's like super difficult, or there's money problems, or bedroom problems, or you meet somebody that you like better, or that initial spark goes away and you just fall out of love, or you're just unhappy for any reason, then divorce is totally understandable. They said to him, Why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? He said to them, Because Moses wasn't woke enough. He was some rich, spoiled prince who was probably white and a tool of the patriarchy. So why do you care what he thinks? And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman, it's totally cool with God as long as you're happy. That is all God wants, after all. The disciples said to him, That sounds super convenient. Thanks, Jesus. Wow. So inspirational. This has been a reading from the SJW Bible. And remember, the only truth that matters is your truth. And welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us here on Tactics. Now, a couple of things that I wanted to bring up. First of all, I did get a comment during the break. John from Millbrook saying, I have faith in our people to solve this problem. You know what? I do too. And the thing that I've really liked about this news day, because for the past at least a solid week, it seemed like all of the news was bad, and I understand that. We're in a crisis. That's to be expected. But I'm starting to see some light at the end of the tunnel, and this thing with Auburn designing a new way to provide ventilators to people that need it, the fact that we probably aren't even going to need that many extra ventilators, if any at all, the fact that in America, we have yet to deny a single person that needed a ventilator or needed an ICU bed the ability to get one, because we have not hit that level of our hospitals being overwhelmed. I mean, granted, this sucks. There's no way to sugarcoat that. But it sucks a lot worse than we thought it was going to. And that is in part because of what UAB was saying, that it's not time to give up, and this is not the time to just say, okay, we've got it whipped, and then just start going back to our lives as normal. No, that's not the right way to do it. This is and a lot of it is happening because we've been vigilant on this. But yes, I believe in the American people. And I think that that's the big difference between me and the average American and some of the people in Washington or some of the people in the media bubble that just don't have any faith in the American people. We've always been able to overcome things like this. And I think that we're going to do no different with this. Another thing that I wanted to mention before we move on to our next topic, tomorrow we have Colonel John Edismo of the Foundation for Moral Law. He'll be joining us on the program to discuss some of the religious liberty issues that's going on. I know everybody was expecting me, especially since it's kind of my forte, to discuss that today. I'm going to hold off on that right now and give some commentary tomorrow with somebody that's actually an attorney that specifically deals with constitutional cases, and he said that he should have some news on what's going on with the Supreme Court right now and hearing a case in Kentucky that they tried to shut down the drive-in services for them. So that should be a fascinating interview. I know that I'm looking forward to it. I hope that you are too, so join us tomorrow to see that interview. Now, one thing that I would be remiss if I did not comment on today is that, boy, Trump's press conference today, he gave it to the media with both barrels and did not apologize. And the sheer spectacle of it, I have to be honest, gave me a great deal of pleasure. Like, I enjoyed watching him tear into the media because they are corrupt, because they are constantly trying to give the worst possible interpretation of the data, the worst possible interpretation of the news. They're constantly trying to cast Trump as the megalomaniac bad guy. I mean, for Pete's sake, the other day the media was actually digging into whether or not Trump was going to be making money off of what is it? Chloroquine. I'll use the common name. I wanted to sound smart. It didn't work. So I'm just going to use the common name, the hydrochloroquine drug that he was touting. Look, they did find, and they did uncover this, and I know that this is super shocking to people who are fans of Trump, that he did actually have stock in a company that creates this, 50-year-old drug, hydrochloroquine. They found out that he did have money in it. And if this thing takes off and the stocks double, he stands to make about $2,000. So, I mean, obviously, that's the reason that Trump was pushing this thing. That's the reason that Trump is hoping this is the new miracle drug that fixes COVID-19, because he has dozens of dollars put down on it, and he might make, a couple thousand if this thing really takes off. So, yeah, a billionaire like Trump, he's real concerned with whether or not hydrochloroquine winds up being a new miracle drug that everybody is administering to people. I mean, the way that the media has gone after this guy on a number of different occasions, claiming that he's the reason that this idiot that drank fish tank cleaner that had a similar name to it, and then his wife, who went on all of the talk shows blaming President Trump, turns out that she's actually literally a Democrat donor. The way that they have just handled this whole thing and trying to make Trump out to be the bad guy and score political points in the middle of a pandemic is sickening, and I think that that's the reason that Trump today decided, you know what, screw it, I'm done with the kid gloves, I'm done trying to pander and be the nice guy and try to be the adult in the room, so I'm just coming after them, and I'm tired of the media trying to paint what I talk about in this media conference and trying to paint that in a negative light, so I'm going over their heads. I'm going straight over their heads. I'm doing it on the medium where the American people are most likely to be listening to me and listening directly to me, and I'm going to take this message that the media has been unfair to me and has been unfair in their coverage of the virus and has tried to intentionally cause panic for no reason and harp on political divides, as opposed to talking about how really we're working together with the Democrats and having decent relationships with a lot of Democrat governors. We're going to blow that narrative up, and we're going to do it right in their face so the American people can see it. Is it a strong political move? Honestly, I don't know. Because there's two different ways that this could really be taken. There is the one theory that because you're having a lot of people that are not necessarily Trump boosters, they voted for Trump, but they're not married to the guy and they could go a different way, or you have people that are just kind of independents in the middle that are watching this just because they want the information that they're going to get on the coronavirus and how that our status is going in the country, that they're watching that aren't necessarily people that are just rah-rah Trump cheerleaders. There's a couple ways they could take this. First, they could look at it and say, well, that's not presidential at all. And the danger of people doing that is that they don't understand that these daily press briefings are daily press briefings. In other words, there are a lot of people that mistakenly kind of assume that these things don't happen all the time, and that the president doesn't routinely defend himself against people that are criticizing him, be they in the media or not, at these press briefings. That's part of the reason that they're here, is to give the White House a platform on which to voice their positions, explanations for their policies. So what he did, if you're ignoring the tone and just looking at the raw facts that he put out there, defending why the president took the position that he did, explaining why he did what he did and when he did it, those things are not things that are uncommon to these press briefings. They are on a bigger platform because of this crisis. There are more people that are watching them because of this crisis, and the president is doing it himself as opposed to having a surrogate coming up and speaking on his behalf, which is not usually what happens. The president doesn't usually attend these things on a daily basis, but they do happen on a daily basis. And they are essentially the White House going out and explaining themselves, explaining policies. That's what they're supposed to be. And so it could be possible that one of these independents that we're talking about watches this, doesn't understand that, and thinks that these things are specifically just supposed to be about the coronavirus, and go, why is Trump essentially trying to explain what his administration was doing in response to this thing on a medium that is supposed to be reserved specifically for information on coronavirus? Now, of course, they're wrong in that, because that's not what these things are, nor is it what they were ever designed to do. The White House basically just repurposed them for that during this time. But the independent person that is watching these things for the first time in their life probably doesn't realize that. And so that's one way that a more independent person, or maybe even somebody that voted for Trump but is kind of on the fence as to whether they will this time, is watching it. And so that they could take it in a very negative light, not understanding that context. It is also possible, and I think that this is at least likely for a decent amount of these independents, that they don't necessarily have a deep-seated distrust for the media, even if they know that they're biased. And they don't necessarily have a ton of trust in Trump, and they don't just assume that whatever he says, it must be true. They're a little bit more open-minded than that. And they watch this spectacle, and they go, oh my gosh, look at what the media has been doing to this guy. I didn't even realize, because I've just been watching the press briefings and not been watching, I don't keep CNN on the background in my house every night, or MSNBC, or whatever other mainstream media outlet. I'm not somebody that consumes news like that on a normal basis. They've really been saying all this stuff about this guy? And so maybe that sparks a little bit of curiosity. If I had to guess, I'd say that it's pretty close to down the middle. I think you're probably going to have about 60% of people taking the former and 40% taking the latter, to where they're a little bit more curious and going, man, I had no idea that the media was just going after this guy and lambasting him on things that don't even make sense in the middle of a pandemic. I hope that more people take that position, but I'm not sure. And so it was a very bold political play by the president. It was, I think, a calculated risk that both he and his advisors knew that, yeah, this could backfire, but this also could actually gain some political ground by doing this, by going over the media's head, not letting them filter out what I'm saying or take certain things out of context or try to mislead people, which they do on a very regular basis when it comes to these press hearings. Let's go directly to the American people, speak directly to them, no filter, tell them why the media is fooling them. And that's the reason that we're going to do it. We're going to go at them with both barrels. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's how I see it. And I think that that's probably their motivation, the reason that they decided to remove the gloves and sort of let Trump say what he wanted to. I don't know if it's going to work or not, but I didn't disagree really with anything that Trump said, because, well, I say that, I'm sure that there were some points of disagreement that I could have. I remember thinking a couple times, okay, Trump, you're exaggerating a little bit there. But a lot of the stuff that he's talking about how the media has been grossly unfair to him, and how the media tried to relentlessly downplay hydrochloroquine, which it's not a miracle drug. It doesn't solve the thing, but there have been some very promising results done by medical doctors, for example, in the state of Louisiana, that implemented this basically statewide and has been faring a lot better than other states that refuse to. And Trump actually jokingly but I think that he was probably correct, saying that me mentioning it probably slowed the rollout a little bit because people didn't trust it simply because I said it. I mean, I know that he said that as a joke, but he was probably right in that. There were probably governors and legislators that didn't want that to be the case just because Trump can't be right. If Trump says it, it must be a lie. That's kind of the way that they tend to operate. But anyway, they did at one point run a series of clips that, if you weren't paying close attention, looked very similar to a campaign ad. And you could tell that there was one reporter there that was trying to nail Trump on that. He was trying to say, oh, so you had White House staff in the past 2 hours just throw these clips together and make it look like a campaign ad? First of all, it wasn't exactly, to use the president's word, it wasn't exactly something that was produced because it didn't have like graphics. It wasn't put together to give one clear particular message. It was just a string of news clips thrown together to make a point. And I know that some campaign ads, they're basically just that anyway. But the point is, unless Trump actually tried to use this to campaign, I don't think that you could get him on some kind of charge of using government dollars and government resources in the form of labor to create something that's effectively a campaign ad form, especially when you consider that essentially the press secretary, whether you're talking about Trump's or Obama's or Bush's or anybody else's, is supposed to be there to explain and give clarification in those press briefings for what the president did. Well, you could argue that trying to make the president look good and trying to explain what the president does, that's really just campaigning. You're not going to be able to make the case to the American people, at least not convincingly, in my opinion, that this was somehow wrong or incorrect, or that there's some kind of underlying legal problem there, that if the White House puts together a video and the video happens to cast the president in a positive light, then that must mean that they were really working on his campaign and they were really trying to get him votes. No, that's a pretty big logical and legal leap that I don't think that they're going to be able to make. So you could tell they were trying to play gotcha, but I just don't think anybody's going to buy that horse, personally. I mean, I'm sure people on the left are going to, but they would have assumed that he was doing that regardless. They're convinced that he's a crook already, so it's not really going to be something that moves the needle, is the most succinct way to say that. Here's the thing, though. When it's all said and done, I don't know if that strategy is going to work. I don't know if that strategy is going to be something that is ultimately good for President Trump. But personally, and I get that this is an opinion area. I'm not saying that President Trump violated any laws or anything like that. I wish the president would stay out of it. And I wish that the president would let people in the media defend him. For example, you've got some people that are just absolute Trump loyalists that seem to go along with whatever the president does. People like Sean Hannity, who, by the way, also appears on News Radio 1440. You can listen to him at 8 o'clock. But you have people like that could have made this case very easily for people. And you also have people even like me that just call balls and strikes, and when the president does something right, I praise him for it. When he does something wrong, I criticize him for it. Let us fight with the media, Mr. President. That's not your job, that's our job. Let us do our job. But let's be honest. Part of the reason that he's in the White House right now is because people saw him as somebody that would go after the media. So, politically, what do I know? I would personally rather people like me and people like Mark Levin and Glenn Beck and other people that are just fair-minded that call balls and strikes and praise the president when he does something good. Let us fight with the media when they're being dishonest. But I have to say, I understand why President Trump's first instinct would be go directly to the people. Because that's the reason he's sitting in the big office in the first place. The fact that he went after the media is probably the reason he has the job that he has now. And so, politically, it may not be a bad move. One other thing that I wanted to talk about, and I think that this is of the utmost importance. What are the odds that we've overreacted to this? On a scale of 1 to 10, I genuinely want you to sit there and think, and I don't think that there's any right answer because this is going to be based on your observations. And I don't think that I'm not even sure that there is a right answer. I'm just trying to get you to think and process this. On a scale of 1 to 10, do you think that we have overreacted? And by the way, I'm not even saying the government, because I think the government's response is, oh yeah, it's a 10. There's no question. Like trying to shut down churches forcibly and ticketing people $500 for attending a church service, things like that. There's no question in my mind. I'm sure that there are people with differences of opinion. There's no question in my mind that's a gross overreaction by leaps and measures. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking if we as the American people have overreacted. Because I tell people all the time not to panic, but I'm also seeing people that even though they're not running around a room in a circle with their arms flailing like this, that doesn't mean they're not in a panic. If they are making concessions to liberty and freedom, and they are perfectly okay with the government stripping their rights away with no recourse and no ability to get them back, then I would say that's an overreaction. With us, for example, shutting down churches and having either live streams or having people conduct services in their own home, I actually thought that that was the right call. It's one that I called for with my own congregation and was glad to see when they wound up doing that. But my point in all of this is, was that an overreaction? Do you think that we're going to get to the end of this thing and look back and say, wow, we were way too cautious on this? We probably would have just had a slightly worse flu season than normal if we had just let this thing run its course as normal. Right now, I'm at about a 4. Because based on some things that I'm learning about the projections and the models that have been put out there, and some of the people that are funding those models, and some of the models that were put out that specifically were not counting the fact that people would voluntarily social distance and try to keep themselves healthy, that kind of thing. You know, personally, I think that I'm at about a 4 of saying that society as a whole probably overreacted. I'm glad that we're taking precautions, and as somebody who has a pretty significant risk factor, actually 2 significant risk factors of this thing being a little bit more likely to take me out than the average person, I appreciate the fact that society has essentially seen fit to take a lot of these precautions. But at the same time, I do think that the more evidence that I'm seeing and the more that I look at this thing, the more I'm starting to think that we did overreact at least some. I'm not saying that there should have been no response. I think a lot of people automatically, when you start talking about this, throw you into 2 camps. Either you're for shutting down the country for 18 months until we have a vaccine for this thing, or you're in favor of absolutely no change whatsoever. We go about our daily business as though nothing is happening. And the thing is, and this is the funny part, I don't know of anybody that actually takes those positions. There's definitely a sliding scale there where some people will take an extreme position or another one. But I think the vast majority of us are somewhere in the middle. That now we're looking back at this and saying, maybe we didn't have to shut down the entire economy. And I think the government's response has just been ridiculous. But just looking at our own willingness to shut things down and our own willingness to voluntarily do some things, I think we may have overshot the mark. And granted, it's better to overshoot in this particular situation than undershoot and do too little and have a whole bunch of people dying that could have been avoided. But considering how much damage we've done to the economy already, I'm wondering if there was a more measured response we could have taken. Now, you may disagree with me on that, and right now, I rarely say this because it's usually just a debate tactic to avoid having an actual conclusion, and it's usually the sign of a weak argument, but with this one, there really is just so little information that I'm not sure we can know whether or not one particular response was the correct or incorrect response. But I think that we're going to look back at this and say we probably should have known to scale it back at least some. That we didn't have to go to quite such extreme measures in order to get this thing under control. Maybe I'm wrong on that. I don't know. But I really do think that perhaps we're overreaching it. I think that the government response has easily been a 9 or a 10. I think our overreaction has been about a 4. But what has amazed me is when I even start asking questions about this. There are certain people that want to completely shut me up, that don't want to listen, that will automatically, and what's funny is I've been accused of both by extremes on both sides, of wanting to just shut down the entire country and never come out of my house again, or do the opposite and just want to reopen the country, act like nothing happened, and a whole bunch of people get sick and die. And I want neither of those things. But the fact that people want to shut me down for even asking the question, I think is very telling. And it reminded me of this fantastic quote by Benjamin Franklin, who I've actually quoted quite a bit recently because of his comments on the relationship between security and freedom. But this is another great quote by him, that if everyone is thinking alike, no one is thinking. I think that's so important for us to remember. Because ultimately, we need to remember ourselves. That if everybody seems to be going down this one path and nobody's questioning it and everybody's just going along and there's no resistance, then that may be a pretty good sign that there are not enough people asking whether this is the right path or not. I would rather go down the correct path and have somebody annoying me the entire time trying to convince me that we're going down the wrong path and be wrong, that person be wrong, than I would to go down that right path without anybody suggesting maybe we ought to change course. Because there is at least a chance that I am on the wrong path and need somebody to bring that up so I can at least reconsider it. This, I think, is a fantastic opportunity for some self-reflection and to look back and actually think through some of these problems. I think we need to invite differences of opinion right now. I think we need to be listening to people who are thinking differently about this epidemic than we are, because if all we're doing is talking to people that agree with us and existing in that echo chamber, then we could be wildly off course and never know it. Never even consider that we may be doing something wrong. And so I think that it's very telling of people that are just kind of caught up in that panic herd mentality, that they don't want anybody telling them that they might be wrong. They just want to go ahead and do it, and they want no dissent. That's a person that has shut off their brain. They are refusing to think through this problem. And I think that's a very dangerous place for us to be. It's never a good idea to just refuse to hear alternate opinions and be so set on your path that you've chosen that you don't want to even consider that maybe you're not going the right way. I think that's a very dangerous mindset to be in. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Today's Chaplain's Report, we're going to be continuing in the book of 1 Samuel. And this particular story is where Samuel first hears the call of the Lord. Now, in the time of prophets, this is in that intermediate period between judges and kings. And so we're seeing, and I mean that not by the books, I mean the actual period of people judging Israel versus Israel having an actual set king. Samuel's story really starts that off. And because of that, there had been a lack of God speaking to some of his judges and some of his prophets, but all of a sudden the call of the Lord, where God speaks directly to a person, comes to Samuel when he's just a child. And really watching this play out and watching this little episode in Samuel's life is fascinating for a number of reasons. First of all, one of the things that we see very early on is that when Samuel hears this call, he thinks it's Eli, the man that takes care of him, a priest living there in Shiloh. And so he rises out of bed and goes and talks to the priest Eli, and he says, "Why'd you call me?" And he says, "I didn't call you. Go back to bed." That's a paraphrase, but that's essentially what happened. And then God calls Samuel again, and Samuel jumps up and heads over to Eli and he says, "Why did you call me?" He says, "Like I said before, I didn't call you. Go back to bed, Samuel." I mean, if you're a parent or you've ever taken care of a small child, this should be an episode that doesn't sound all that unfamiliar to you. Maybe not with the calling specifically, but you can imagine the state of mind that Eli is in. And then this third time is the one that we're going to look at here in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 7 through 9. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, nor had the word of the Lord yet been revealed to him. So the Lord called Samuel again for the third time, and he arose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." Then Eli discerned that it was the Lord calling the boy. And Eli said to Samuel, "Go lie down, and it shall be, if he calls you, that you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now, despite this being the calling of Samuel as a young child, I think there's actually several really fascinating lessons that we can take from this one little passage. First of all, we're not really sure how old Samuel is. The Bible's not very specific. We just know that he's a boy. He could be 4 or 5, or he might be 12, but he's probably not 13. And the reason that we say that is, of course, in Jewish culture and Jewish society, even back then, once you were 13, you were a man. And the Bible probably would have called him a man, or at the very least a youth, to indicate that he's a teenager. Not so in this passage. And so Samuel's probably a little kid. You know, anywhere in that intermediate period between being able to talk and going through the becoming a man process at the age of 13. So he's somewhere in that window. We're just not sure exactly where. But the fact that God chooses to come to him as a little kid as opposed to an adult, which he normally does with his prophets, I think is just absolutely fascinating. Maybe it's because all of the adults were not doing what they were supposed to do, and we actually talked about some of Eli's failings in a previous chaplain's report. I don't know. But I just find it fascinating that Samuel's first prophecy is as a little kid, as a child, before he's actually an adult. So why do you think that God doesn't come to him in more grandiose fashion? Because I want you to think about what this story implies about God's calling to Samuel. Samuel thought that it was the voice of the only man that has really known him as kind of a father-son relationship. So in some ways, it was almost like God calling to Samuel sounded like his father calling him. Now, maybe God used his voice and imitated Eli's voice. Maybe it was just Eli was the only person in that dwelling at the time, and so Samuel just assumed that if he heard what sounded like a grown man's voice, it must be Eli calling him. We're not sure, but it's quite possible, and I think it's even likely, this is my personal opinion, not scripture talking, that because he wanted Samuel as a little kid to be comfortable, that he just kind of spoke to him in Eli's voice. I think that's pretty likely, especially considering that Samuel was so incredibly confident that it was Eli calling him, instead of assuming that it was something else, because kids may be a little bit more gullible and naive than adults, but they know their parents' voice. And so it's interesting to me that God chooses to come to him in a form that at least sounded something like, if not exactly like, the only father figure Samuel had ever really known. I think that was an intentional choice on God's behalf to help him understand that intimate relationship that God wanted with Samuel and wants with all of us too. He doesn't call us with the voice of some grandiose pagan god that he shoots up out of a giant fire and towers over everything and yells at us. No, he comes to Samuel in the form of a very unassuming voice. So much so that he didn't even realize it was God talking to him. He figured it was the priest. That's what Samuel thought was going on here. Now, it's true that God does come to people in grandiose fashion in other parts of the scripture. In Moses' case, for example, he speaks to him out of a burning bush. We're all familiar with that story. In the case of Jacob, he came to him in the form of some kind of celestial being. We don't know if that was actually God or if he sent an angel when it came to the wrestling match. But we do assume that God contacted him in somewhat grandiose fashion, whether he sent an angel or whether he delivered the message himself. Either way, it was certainly much more obvious that this was not a mundane thing like it happened with Samuel. So why is that? Why is the approach different? Well, I think it's because Samuel was in a very different place than Moses and Jacob. Because you remember what happened with Moses is Moses hears the voice of the Lord, and even though he's convinced it really is God, his faith isn't very strong. He doesn't want any part of that, and he really doesn't want God's calling. He wants to go back to his normal life of tending sheep. When God calls Jacob, Jacob is familiar with God. His father and his grandfather have been following God there, for a good portion of their lives. But Jacob seems honestly kind of hesitant to fully embrace God as being a exclusive God and the creator of the universe and all that stuff. And you can tell by his reaction saying basically from this point, then God is going to be my God, that he wasn't really super 100% on board with it beforehand. And so Samuel, with the faith of a child, already has a bond with God that God feels comfortable coming to him in this very intimate and unassuming way, and that Samuel would have the faith to listen to God even if he didn't use some big grand gesture to get his attention. In other words, what God did was he observed where his child was and changed his approach and his tone to fit that person. Didn't change the message. The message of obedience and mercy and so on and so forth, that all comes out the same. Whether it's to Moses or to Jacob or to Samuel or to Abraham, God doesn't change who he is, nor does he change the core of his message. What he does change is his approach based on who is hearing the message at the time. And if we're going to be emulators of God, I think that's an important lesson for us to learn too. That sometimes we have to change our approach. The message remains the same. The gospel always remains the same. We don't mince words. We don't beat around the bush or any of that stuff. But what we do is we understand that sometimes a more direct approach is necessary. Sometimes an indirect approach is better. Sometimes something where you just come out and say it is better for that person. Sometimes holding off a little bit and building a relationship before you make a really bold statement or take something that's kind of hard to digest to that person. Sometimes that's smart too, but the message remains the same. And if we're going to be imitators of God, if we're going to bring people to God just the way God brought these men to him, I think we need to understand that sometimes the approach might need to be a little bit different and a little bit tailor-made for that person. One big difference, though, is that God knows our hearts, and we don't. Sometimes we've got to do a little guesswork on that because we don't know a person's soul the way that God does. God knew all of that about Samuel and Moses and Jacob and Abraham and everybody else that he ever called. And so God kind of had an advantage on us, which shouldn't surprise us. But ultimately, I think even that is a comforting message, because that means that God does know our hearts and that he approaches us in a certain way that is best for us. And that means that regardless of how he tries to communicate with us, how he tries to get our attention, how he tries to convey his messages, whether sometimes he has to use a pretty harsh approach or sometimes whether he can do it a little more gently, that means that God is looking at us. He cares enough about us to give us individualized attention. And ultimately, he knows our soul well enough to know the best way to reach out to us to bring us closer to him. That's something that fills me with an amazing amount of comfort, and I'm hoping that it does you too. especially at a time where it seems like we're trying to take a blanket approach to everything and try to say one size does fit all and one particular way is right for everyone. I think it's important to understand that God's approach, even though his message always remains identical, sometimes the way he presents it and the way that he presents himself is individualized and tailored to the person and what they need at that time. Stay the course, friends. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media or our business partners. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided by the Dalrata Church of Christ. Copyright